what do you think of where the Labour Party are at today? Because, of course, we have been talking on the show earlier. Tony Blair has made this call today for Labour to save itself, essentially, and he says that none of these leadership candidates are thinking radically enough. Where do you stand?
Well, I think the point that he was making is that actually, if you think about the big challenges we face as a country, not just here in the UK, but globally, so in a world where technology is changing hugely, we have the rise of artificial intelligence, we're seeing the breakdown of the way the economy works in ways that we haven't seen before, we're seeing the threat of climate change. The old models and the old prescriptions aren't fit for purpose, and I don't think it's just a problem for Labour. I think our politics is in crisis and decline across the spectrum. Our kind of first past the post system here in the UK, I think, is kind of hiding the reality. But, the Conservative Party, you look at their membership base, you look at the way that people think about politics and politicians, and there is a crisis there because our politics isn't speaking to the things that people care about and they're worried about. And I think his point is that you fundamentally need to change that. The Labour Party does, but all the political parties do, if they want to be relevant in people's lives and if they want to convince people that actually they can make their lives better. And most people don't believe that politicians and our politics in Westminster can make their lives better.
Tom, your response from the right?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think I would have agreed with every single word you had said about 6 months ago. However, in between, we've had a general election
landslide
where more people voted for the winning party, a higher share of people voted for the winning party than anyone since 1979. Boris Johnson got a higher percentage of the vote than Tony Blair did in 1997. That's a fact that's skirted over in a lot of this analysis. So I'm not sure there is that same sense of crisis. I mean, if we look around Europe, we do see a real sense of crisis in countries that have, for example, more proportional voting systems.
Was the crisis just caused by Brexit, Tom?
I think the crisis was mainly, I think
the
Brexit
the
uncertainty was certainly caused by Brexit. I think Brexit was more describing some deeper sense of frustration in the system, and there is definitely a call for people to have more control over their lives, so to devolve power away from politicians in Westminster and towards local communities. But I really feel a sense of positivity now that we're moving towards a space that can allow that. And I don't think that there is the same sort of political crisis now in this country that there is, for example, across Central Europe, in Ireland, in many other parts of the world. I think this country is now almost bucking the trend towards stability.
I fear that's hubris, but only time will tell.
Well, Miata, you were talking, though, about these big issues that politics needs to tackle. And one of the points Tony Blair was making is that Labour seems to be picking on culture war issues, small fry issues, niche issues, and they might be important and worthy, don't get me wrong, trans rights, LGBT rights. But let's have a listen to what he had to say, and I'll get you to respond off the back.
So you've got to distinguish between the advocacy of certain things that are right, and you can say that about whether it's about gay rights, transgender rights, whatever it is. You've got to distinguish between that and launching yourself politically into a kind of culture war with the right. So if you go, transgender rights is our big thing, and the right goes, immigration controls is our big thing, you're going to lose that war. You're going to lose that. So you're not going to advance any of the things you want to do.
Miata, I think he's speaking perfect sense. Your response?
So I think what he was saying is that it is right, and I believe it is right to always be promoting and advocating people's rights. And, the Labour Party was at the vanguard of promoting rights for BME people in this country, for promoting rights for the LGBT community, and they should be at the vanguard of promoting rights for the transgender community. But I think his point is that when a party is defined by an issue, so, coming out of this, the Labour Party will need to say to the country, what is our thing that we're fighting about? Against the backdrop of an economy that's not working for the majority of people, against climate change, against all these challenges, this might not be the issue that speaks to the country and allows a party to connect with the party. That's a political, tactical point. I think there's some merit to it, but I don't think that negates from the fact that fundamentally it is right to talk about rights and to champion rights. And actually parties that have always done that have made, my life as a BME person much better, has made the rights of people much better, and that should not be lost.
But Tom, is that what this trans rights pledge is about? Because Tony Blair today said he would not sign the pledge. Keir Starmer, the favourite as leader, has not signed the pledge, although he has made his own promises. What's your take on this pledge? Because a lot of people say, actually, this is about shutting down discussion about trans issues.
Well, I think the most contentious part of that pledge was one whereby there would be automatic exclusion for certain individuals who express certain views with regard to who can or can't define themselves as a man or a woman, about this issue of self-identification for transgender people. And I think that probably if you're trying to reach across the aisle, so to speak, if you're trying to create a political consensus, having automatic exclusions like that isn't the best place to start. And I can totally understand why people, not just like Keir Starmer, who's trying to pitch himself as a unifier, but also people like Richard Bergen in the deputy leadership race have not signed this pledge. I think that there are elements of it that are problematic if you're trying to reach a solution whereby everyone can feel inclusive. And I think this is the big difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party on an issue like this. The Conservative Party under David Cameron advocated equal marriage, and it did so in a mainstream way. He said that David Cameron used to speak about how he really believed in the value of institutions like marriage and that they should be open to everyone. That was almost a conservative argument for a progressive issue, and there are better ways to reach across the aisle to build those broad consensuses than I think the Labour Party is touching right now.
Because Miata Dawn Butler, who waded into this debate during a discussion on Good Morning Britain earlier in the week, one of the things that she's been criticised for is saying that babies are essentially born without gender. And most folk, I imagine, throughout the country just think that that is madness.
Well, so
what do you think?
What I think is the part of the I don't think we should trivialize this issue. I think your starting point in all of this is that actually the trans community, a hugely vulnerable community whose rights at the moment aren't properly recognized neither in law or in the way that we conduct ourselves in society, and we need to. And it is a new thing for a lot of people to get their heads around and to grapple with. And you've got to be sensitive in the way that we engage with it. I mean, for me, I think the pledge was probably the difficulty with pledges is that they're quite blunt things. They're not particularly nuanced, and it's quite hard to reconcile them with the reality of trying to put something in practice. And there are genuine issues to work through that tries to kind of balance the rights of transgender people with the rights of, for example, vulnerable women in certain settings, and that's where the controversy about this has come about. And I just think that you have to start with the principle that we absolutely must try and protect the rights of all communities and find the best way to do that. And then you work through the specifics. You work through the specifics of particular settings where actually there will be a conflict of interest between the rights of vulnerable women and the rights of access for transgender community. And you work through the best way to do that. And my view is that with political will, there's always a way. But don't trivialise the debate, and actually don't turn the debate into something that is divisive, because on this, the fundamentals, I think, actually is quite unifying.
Now, we're in the next hour going to come to the US political debate last night, but just want to get your response to a little bit of breaking news just in, which is that Roger Stone, who is, of course, Donald Trump's sort of confidant for so many years, and arguably the man who actually encouraged him initially to run for politics and a key advisor in the early days of his presidential run, has just been sentenced to over 3 years in prison. So it's a 44-month sentence. And of course, it raises immediately the question of whether the president will pardon his old mate, Tom Harwood.
Well, this is a big moment in politics, and I think, if anything, looking towards the electoral landscape, we're seeing Donald Trump, whose approval rating is actually climbing back up to where it was about when he became president. He only got about 48% of the vote initially, and it's climbing back up to that space. And perhaps we're seeing a moment whereby Donald Trump can actually say, look at the political establishment, sort of the people who voted for me, the people who are with me are being attacked by every sort of different angle. And perhaps this is, if he gets re-elected, something that he would overturn. I'd be hesitant to say that he'd pardon Roger Stone this side of an election, though.
Although he doesn't necessarily seem to worry too much about pardoning people, does he? Yeah, he's doing it left, right and centre at the moment. And maybe because he thinks the more I do it, the less of a story it becomes, because, of course, Rod, I've forgotten his last name, but he was the former Democratic governor who went to jail. He's just pardoned him. And actually, maybe it's not such a big deal when it's Trump who's doing these things.
Well, President Trump seems to get away with the sorts of things that no other prime minister, president, political leader can do. And I think he will chance it. He will try his luck. Up to now, he's not played by any of the rules. And quite frankly, he's not been damaged by it. But I always come back to the fact that he may be sort of free and loose with institutions and the rules of the game and the way that things work, but it fundamentally undermines democracy in the US. And the things that he's doing gradually just chipping away at the things that ensures our democracy works, that ensures that the executive is held to account. And that's bad and dangerous in the long run. So
you're a fan then?
But ultimately, Roger Stone is a man with a tattoo of Richard Nixon on his back. He is someone who has seen throughout his entire long political career. He first worked on Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, doing certain skullduggery back in the 70s. He's someone who has seen contentious political pardons in the past and will certainly be urging Donald Trump to pardon him in the future.
Well, he's 67 years old. This is a very big story in the States, but I don't believe it will at all damage Donald Trump's electoral chances. However, Tom, you do have to admit, when you look at the number of people around Donald Trump at the start of that campaign who have now been caught up in serious legal difficulties, it's not something that many other politicians, if any, would survive.
No, but it feeds into that narrative again that it's Donald Trump versus the world, that the entire establishment is out to get him. And I think it reaffirms the worldview of so many people who think that Donald Trump is crooked and is wrong and is mixing with bad people. But it also reaffirms the worldview of people who think that Donald Trump is their fighter against the establishment. And of course, everyone's trying to do this big conspiracy to bring him down. I'm not sure how much truth there is on both sides. There might be a point somewhere in between there that's right. But I think the most unifying thing about this is that people on the left and on the right in American politics now are quite thankful that there's a pretty rigid constitution holding back the powers of the executive. And it's quite right to promote that and make sure that under presidents of both colours, the fundamental constraints of government that the Constitution provides for are not undermined.
Well, they do have incredible rules over there, though. I mean, just this Tuesday, it was Rob Blagojevich, who was the former governor of Illinois, whose sentence he wiped after watching his wife make a plea on his favourite news channel in the US. But he was just one of 7 people who were granted presidential pardons this week. The others included the disgraced financier Michael Milken, also the former New York Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik. So actually, maybe it's not such a big deal.
Well, it's funny because
Trump's just clearing his mates, and that's how the system does work over there, Miata. You can do it if you want.
Well, he certainly is. And the question will be, is there any kind of backlash to that? And his approval rating is...
He won't want Roger Stone to go to prison.
No, and I suspect he will probably want to or pardon him if he thinks he can get away with it. And at some point, whether you are a supporter of his or not, you have to care about the Constitution, the rule of law, the fundamentals of the democracy in the US, and you'd hope that people across the aisle kind of just try and put some parameters around what he can and can't do, because in the long run, the US governance and constitution has to operate beyond Donald Trump, and if he allow him to trash a set of things, it makes it that much harder.
Stay tuned. The political panel continues in just a moment with Miata Fanbula from the left and Tom Harwood from the right. Why has Boris Johnson not been to the flood zones? And also Dominic Cummings getting involved in eugenics. Did he actually do anything wrong, though? We'll debate that in a couple. Welcome back. Why have Harry and Meghan been thrust out of Buckingham Palace? Well, we're going to debate that in just a moment with our royal commentator, Richard Fitzwilliams. But back now with Tom Harwood, the reporter at Guido Fawkes from the right, and Miata Fanbula, who is the chief executive of the New Economics Foundation from the left. Miata, how angry are you that Boris Johnson hasn't been to visit the flood zones, apparently because he wants to avoid a media jamboree?
Well, so I'm not persuaded by the argument that he wants to avoid a media jamboree, because Prime Minister Johnson doesn't seem like the sort of Prime Minister that would avoid a media jamboree. In fact, he courts it. But I do think it sends a bad message. And the reason for visiting flood areas is to show some empathy and some sympathy to people who are having an absolutely horrendous time. And I think the inability to do that, I think, says something about his leadership and his sort of instincts about how to kind of respond at these moments of crisis. But for me, the more fundamental question is, these floods are not an abnormality. They're the new norm as a result of climate change. And so we have to become much, much better at responding, because this is going to be happening over and over again. But more fundamentally, there is a big question about how we respond to climate change. And, my argument has always been, we're doing stuff, but we're not doing stuff fast enough with the urgency that this requires. And what I want from the government is to use these moments to focus its mind, which requires a big, big programme to think about how we take carbon out of our economy and how we respond to climate change.
But Tom, we're doing it, aren't we? We're doing it faster than any other country in the Western world. We're going to be at net carbon emissions by 2050, something the US is certainly not doing, Australia's not doing, China's not even coming close. We're leading the way.
Yeah, not only were we the first country to commit to a net zero 2050 target, we're also the only G20 nation over the last decade that has reduced its carbon emissions by 25%. That's miles ahead of countries that traditionally people in this part of the world would think are doing a lot better. Germany, for example, has had a lower rate of reduction than America. Now, that's a difference between a country.
We're doing good things, aren't we, on the environmental front?
We are doing good things, but that is in part reporting. So, for example, we don't count some of the emissions that come from aviation, some of the emissions that come from trade in the way that other countries do. So there's a kind of reporting piece in there. But if you look at the government's own climate watchdog, it will say, if we want to get to our 2050 target, we are not moving fast enough. We've done the easy stuff. So we've taken carbon out of electricity, great, step in the right direction, but taking electricity out of transport, dealing with electricity in our aviation sector, we haven't even begun to touch that. And that's a really hard piece. And for me, the big question is not just the job of taking carbon out, but, for certain parts of the country, for communities that are reliant on fossil fuel intensive industries, you're asking for quite a huge restructuring. And
which is why we just have to do it carefully over a long period of time in order to make overall change.
Well, so I would say that we probably, as the impacts of climate change start biting, we probably don't have the luxury of time. And also it requires a plan. So we've got to be very deliberate about what the transition looks like.
There is. Look at how quickly we're intending to phase out diesel and petrol and hybrid cars. Actually, something I think is probably happening way too fast.
Well, so I think it's a step in the right direction, but I come back to, this isn't a nice to have. This is absolutely fundamental and existential. And yes, we're doing things, but, yes, we might be moving slightly further than some countries in some areas. We're behind others in other areas, like renewables. Germany are far ahead of us on that. And so we all need to move forward.
Germany just closed down all of its nuclear power stations. That massively shot up its carbon emissions. They had to rely on imported coal, imported gas. It was a terrible, terrible mistake. This country should have been building more nuclear power over the last 30 years. We chose not to do that. And now we are actually quite fortunate in that the technology has moved on faster than some people anticipated. The real answer to this question isn't top-down diktats from the government, isn't saying you must use this existing technology now and do it tomorrow and uproot people's lives in that way. It's to help encourage innovation and science, because ultimately that is the way that we move forward.
Well, speaking of science, just before we go, I have to quickly get your verdict from both of you on Dominic Cummings being dragged in by The Guardian into an apparent row about eugenics.
This is so silly.
Go on, why?
Currently, it is the policy of the NHS, if, for example, you're carrying out IVF, technically that could be described as eugenics, because do you know what? You can pick what embryo you want and it's screened for hereditary diseases. That is technically eugenics. I don't think it makes much sense to describe it as such, because when people say the word eugenics, you think of horrific statist programs of changing populations through government. And I think that's horrific. And I think it's wrong when the media describes something like screening babies for diseases before they're born as as the same as trying to change the genetic makeup of a population.
And yeah, to the point that Dominic Cummings was making, I mean, you're talking about the need to move on technologically and all of that type of thing. All he was saying is that if this was something that was going to be done by rich people, then he'd want the NHS to get involved so that rich people didn't get further advantages in life. Surely something you agree with?
A sort of level playing field, yes. Look, the problem with Dominic Cummings and why he's always in the spotlight is that he does say these controversial things to slightly kind of prime himself up, I think, but also to make these wholly kind of unhelpful points. And I think it's particularly problematic off the back of the fact that he hired an advisor that clearly has some very unquestionable views. And then it also raises questions about the Prime Minister's own sense of values and integrity when it comes to some of these issues. So I think it's only an issue, not in isolation, but against the backdrop of all those other issues. And I think that good advisors should get on with the job of advising and helping to run the country. They shouldn't be doing half the things that he's doing. And I think it's bad for government. I think it's bad for the Prime Minister. And I think he's probably the sort of advisor that in the long term he might want to think about getting rid of.
What a great debut from Miata Fanbula, the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation from the left. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, Tom Harwood from the right, the reporter at Guido Fawkes.